Lastly, the web will become more fragmented, more balkanized. And I've talked about some of that already, but really it's happening by platforms. And what I mean by platforms is companies that are building, if you like, their own part of the web that is run by them and that acts like a little microcosm of the web that allows people to develop things on top of it, where they can serve things up to users within a sort of a walled garden environment. And that means that people don't go onto the full web, they stay in that little walled garden and they're somewhat shut off from the real world around them. And there are multiple examples of those platforms, and three obvious ones I've mentioned already: Google, Apple, Facebook. You could put Microsoft in here, you could put others in here as well. But these are three of the biggest ones, and they're all building their own platforms. And Facebook is itself a platform as a website, and people have applications, companies like Zynga, which has Farmville and various other games that run pretty much exclusively on Facebook. They've created a whole slew of applications there which clog up my Facebook feed very regularly, but which are creating value on top of what's essentially a platform that Facebook has created. And more, as I say, people consume the web from within Facebook. Apple, through the iPhone, the iPad, the Apple TV, and various other devices, running iOS, which is their operating system for all of these devices. I've created a platform as well where people can stay within a safe environment, they can consume apps that they know have been pre-vetted and so on, but they are then shut off still from the web as a whole. Google's doing similar things with both Android as a mobile operating system, but also through Google Apps and the various Google services and Google Search, as we've already talked about. And so there are these various sort of platforms or islands, if you like, where people can kind of get stuck in a corner of the web and never really leave it, and where that experience is not open and democratic as it might be on the web itself, but rather is more and more controlled by a single company that's making decisions for users about what they can and can't see and access and do. But in fact, those are to some extent integrated platforms as well. There is some overlap between them. Obviously Facebook has applications for the Android platform and for iOS, and so Facebook and these other platforms are integrating in some ways. Apple has just announced that the next version of its iPhone operating system will have deep Twitter integration. It wouldn't be a big surprise to see something similar with Facebook over time as well. And Google and Apple, although they're competitors in many ways, obviously you get Google Search and various Google apps like email and calendar and so on work very well on Apple devices. And obviously people access a lot of Google services from Apple laptops and phones and so on. So there is integration between these platforms, but they are increasingly self-contained corners of the web, if you like, that aren't necessarily open as the web itself is. And that's an extension of both personalization, where these companies are telling me, based on my preferences, what I've bought before, what I've searched for before, they're going to serve me up relevant answers and things that they think I'll like. But it's also an extension of mobilization, where people are retreating from a full web experience back into mobile applications and then getting just a very filtered view of the web. But in both cases, users aren't on the open web anymore, they are in some corner of the web. There are a number of tensions, I've mentioned some of them already, in the future of the internet. Things that are moving in one direction and where users are kind of, at least in some cases, trying to pull it back in the other direction again. Or cases where there are legitimately separate groups of users that want the web to move in different directions. This isn't a comprehensive list, but this is a partial list of some of those tensions that are going on. And I mentioned personalization. We had this book called The Filter Bubble. His argument is essentially that this personalization is a bad thing because it just retrenches us and reinforces our existing prejudices and biases, rather than giving us real information on all the information that's out there in the world. And he's arguing that we should be able to remove those filters at will so that we get unfiltered information. But there's a tension there. People like personalization. They like the fact that these services learn what they like and will serve up things that are relevant to them. Sharing versus privacy, and Facebook's always in hot water because it's always seemingly in the wrong place on this particular spectrum. But privacy is something that's extremely important to many people, but it's also a generational issue where the younger you are, the more likely you are to be willing to share all kinds of things online, or at least not to be very careful about what you share online, whether that's a deliberate or passive behavior. But there's a real tension there, and you just have to look at parents and their kids, for example, around their Facebook usage to see that tension. But Facebook and Google and others are always getting into hot water because of perceived privacy breaches, and there's a real tension there. Safety and openness, the classic example of that I think would be the Apple approach to applications and the Google approach to applications. Apple has this curated application store. They have very strict rules about what can and can't be allowed in. Google doesn't. Google has a very much more open approach where you can publish it to the store and it pretty much appears right away. They do occasionally take things down when they're proven to have malware or other problems, but it's very much more open. But for some people, that's a scary experience. It feels chaotic, it feels dangerous. They worry they're going into hot water in some way. For other people, that's just what they want. They don't want Steve Jobs making the decision for them, essentially, and so they want a more open experience. And then lastly, and this is the one that I referred to with that Andrew King quote earlier on, that there's a sense that all this democracy on the internet just creates a load of rubbish, and in fact what we want is a more creative, professional, high quality experience. And there are certainly some people that would cry and scream if you tried to take that aspect away, but there are other people that would very much like a more managed and curated experience. AOL is still around here in the US, and that's very much what they offer for their users. But those tensions are there on the web. And
can you explain a little bit more this tension between expertise and democracy?
Yeah, so I mean, really, if you look at what people like to consume online, but even beyond online in their world as a whole, there are people that love reading blogs, things that are created by ordinary individuals that don't have a big company behind them that want to just consume that, or that who, when they want to consume videos, will go straight to YouTube and their favorite channel that may be some quirky person somewhere that creates just the kind of videos that they like in their bedroom. But there are other people that want to watch the big blockbuster movies or the television shows from the major television networks, who only want to read newspapers with mastheads that have been around for 150 years and so on and so forth. And so there are people that want a managed experience, and there are people that want that very open kind of Wild West experience. And nobody's suggesting that you shut this off. That's kind of censorship. People, almost nobody wants that except in repressive regimes. But there are people that would drift naturally towards that more managed and curated and high quality experience, and people that prefer this experience. And what Google and Facebook are doing with some of their personalization is, in some ways, trying to match users' preferences with what they feed them. And the worry for some people is that actually, by doing that, you don't get the openness, you don't get the full experience of life, and you just end up retreating back into your corner where you have these crazy thoughts that never get challenged because you're just being fed what you said you want.
And the red points means?
Oh, this was just kind of saying they're kind of sliders that different people, you can imagine if me personally, I might move this one over to the left and this one over to the right. They kind of have the intention. It doesn't mean where we are now or anything like that. This is just to sort of suggest, that these are sort of, you imagine like a graphical, like an equalizer on your stereo, that you kind of move them up and down or side to side. Yes?
Are you suggesting with that you're going to have to get kind of a ranking of expertise when you run a search?
Yeah, I mean, I think that may well be something that, Google does it, I think, behind the scenes and implicitly, but not explicitly today. If you're always clicking on the New York Times result when you look for a certain piece of news, and they're going to promote the New York Times to the top of your search results. Whereas if you're always clicking on the Huffington Post or some obscure blog somewhere, then they're going to promote those results. So there may not be an explicit expertise ranking in there, but they are certainly feeding back to you what you've said you prefer through what you click on and what you search for. Advertising versus free. This is another thing about the internet that many people have commented on. Chris Anderson wrote a great book called Free about how things are more and more free, at least incrementally on the web, and what that means. The challenge is that things that are free online are free for one of only a couple of reasons. They're free because the company's just trying to grow really big before they figure out how to monetize that. Twitter would be an obvious example of that. It's still free to the user, but they still haven't quite figured out how they're going to make money because it is free. The other one is that it's free because it's explicitly ad-funded, and that's the business model. The problem is that when something is free based on advertising, if you're not paying, then you're not the consumer, you're the product, because you're being sold to advertisers. And so essentially, this is not my thought. This was a comment that somebody left on a blog that went kind of viral after they said it, because it seemed to sum up so perfectly what so many people feel about online advertising. And this is one of the fundamental problems with Many of the websites that we use, Facebook, I keep talking about Facebook, but it's a good example again of this, where Facebook's objectives and incentives are very much not aligned with its users' objectives and incentives. Users want to keep as much information private as they can within the circles that they would like it to be kept within. Facebook wants it to be as open as possible because then they can serve up advertising against it, they can expose that information to advertisers and so on, and so it brings users and advertisers and site owners into conflict. And so this is a fundamental tension as well on the internet. People don't talk about enough. But there is this conflict between users and site owners when advertising is a major source of revenue. And so as you go to serve up advertising to people, you have to always be thinking of, am I serving their interests? Is this going to improve their experience on this site or degrade it in some way? So we talked about how we see the internet going over the next few years. I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about some of the implications for the work that you might be doing. On the one hand, you can see this as a golden age for marketers. There's so many of the things that I've talked about are huge helps for people that are trying to target specific customers with specific offerings. There's that well-known phrase from John Wanamaker, I know half the money I spend on advertising is wasted, I just don't know which half. And the personalization, the customization, the semantic web, all of these things hold out the promise that you could eventually serve up to specific users exactly what they're interested in based on either explicitly expressed preferences or implicit preferences based on their behavior, based on what they say on blogs, on Twitter, on Facebook, who they interact with, which sites they consume and so on. So there is this promise that this could be a golden age for marketers because they can reach exactly the consumers they want with exactly the offer that's right for them, be very customized and targeted, and suddenly your return on every advertising dollar is much better. And that breaks out in multiple ways. So the more social aspects of the web, you use people's friends to sell them the goods and services. We've seen this on Facebook where you see the little links on the top right sometimes saying, your friend liked this, don't you want to check it out too, essentially. But you can use the fact that your friends have liked something, whether it's Google's +1 button on its searches, or whether it's on Facebook, or whether it's on Twitter, somebody who's one of your followers or somebody that you follow has recommended a product, that could be used to serve up advertising. Personalization, as I said just now, more and more what people like, and therefore you can make sure you don't serve up the bad stuff and do serve up the stuff they do like. Hulu, which is the big online video site here in the US that does content from multiple television networks, they serve up advertising during the videos, and frequently they will have a little button at the top that says, is this relevant to you, yes or no? And frequently they'll actually replace one of the ads with a little poll that says, do you make decisions about buying washing powder in your house, or do you buy the groceries, do you influence which groceries are bought, or do you make no decisions at all about groceries? And they're really trying to target the advertising much more than regular television advertising could do, which is broadcast to all users just the same. Mobile, I haven't really talked about this aspect of it, but with location-based services on mobile devices, you can now know where people are and therefore send them advertising and other marketing that's appropriate to their specific location. I signed up for a service with AT&T here in the US recently, which sends me text messages whenever I'm close to a store that participates in their program and says, if you take this code that we've just texted you into the store, you'll get 15% off. That's the beginning of that kind of location-based targeted advertising. So not just user behavior-based, but location-based as well. And lastly, automation. So you know more about me because of what I say online, even though I haven't explicitly told you. So these are all the sort of good aspects. But there are also new barriers to connecting with users, and that's the sort of worrying downside of all of this. That increasing fragmentation I talked about means you can't just push something through the web and expect it to get to users, because they're going to be filtering it through Facebook, they're going to be filtering it through mobile applications on Android or Apple devices. And so trying to reach your audience is harder because you have to figure out which of those platforms or communities you have to go through to reach them. Personalization may make it completely impossible to know whether you even can reach the users you're trying to reach. I had that BP search example earlier. If you are BP and you're trying to reach people with a particular message and you're trying to do search engine optimization, for example, that's all very well. You may be able to increase BP's search ranking on your PC, But unfortunately, you can't possibly know what I'm getting in my search rankings because you don't see the way that Google filters my search results based on my own preferences. And so that personalization can actually be a real barrier to reaching the users that you want to reach because you can't possibly know what Google is serving up to them. You can't know what Facebook is filtering for them. Automation may remove some decision making from users. I mean, that refrigerator example I use is a bit hypothetical still, but how do you serve up advertising to a refrigerator? You know, if the refrigerator is making decisions about what you need to buy next time at the store based on what you've run out of and based on what you've bought before, how do you insert yourself into that process and make sure the users are actively making decisions still? As I say, that's an extreme example, but you can see how automation of all kinds of things online suddenly means users are spending less time actually online, making decisions, doing research. They're just having ideal results served up to them where there's no room for interference. And then lastly, social recommendations are very hard to fake and to force. People don't like being pushed things on the basis that a certain friend liked it. They don't like feeling manipulated or feeling that their friends are being manipulated by being used as a tool for advertising. And so that can backfire as well. That has to be very carefully managed. So all of these things are potential downsides of the trends I talked about.
Excuse me, talking about automation,
yeah.
Is only Google filtering or also Bing and Yahoo filtering all the results for you?
Well, you know, Bing does this sort of Facebook-related filtering, and they all do it to some extent. There are some search engines out there now. I think there's one called DuckDuckGo, which explicitly doesn't filter results, and so they're actually using that as a selling point. But with automation here, I mean, that Google stuff is more under the sort of personalization heading. Automation is more the sort of semantic web and Internet of Things type stuff, where, you know, if more of the devices in your life have their own internet connection and are constantly reporting their state and other information about themselves without you, the user, having to do anything, and if websites are increasingly able to pick up on unconscious cues that I'm sending out through my interactions on social networks or through my web searches, then suddenly some decision making may be taken out of my hands, and I may be no longer actively making some of the decisions I did before because I trust my devices, my services to make those decisions for me. I mean, an active example is in Gmail. They now have this priority inbox where you can say, you know, this is important to me, but they're guessing first of all, and then you just tweak the algorithm. So, but you're explicitly saying this is important to me and this isn't, and that's another form of automation where certain things get filtered out and I may never see them. Maybe because I said so, but maybe because Google thought based on my past behavior that I didn't want to see them. And ultimately, the challenge with things like the semantic web, with all the information that people are putting out there about themselves now through Twitter, which is very public, through Facebook, which is semi-private, it's easy for your competitors to know as much about your users as you do, and perhaps even more if they're better at this kind of stuff. So, you know, it used to be that customers could either complain to their friends, in which case it didn't go anywhere, or they would complain back to the company that was providing a product or service, and then they would be the only ones that knew about it. But today people increasingly complain about things on social networking sites and so on, and so that information can be aggregated and gathered by third parties who may be competitors, who may then use that as an opportunity to serve something back. You know, somebody said on Twitter this week, you know, people who think that Twitter is about saying what you had for breakfast are all wrong. Twitter is for complaining about airlines. But because, you know, that is increasingly what people do. They have a bad customer service experience and they whine about it on Twitter. They kind of blow off steam. And if they have 15 followers who are all their friends anyway, it doesn't really matter. But if you have 500, 1,000, 50,000 followers, all of a sudden that's quite significant. And if it gets picked up by some other people and retweeted, then suddenly, you know, it grows exponentially and you have a real network effect. So, but the point is that, you know, you no longer have this binary relationship with your customer where you have information flows only between the two of you. That information flow is now open to everybody, and whoever knows how to take advantage of that can really use it against you if you have a poor experience, and use that to jump in and become a new supplier. To remind you of what I've talked about, the web will be more social because it will be more integrated into the fabric of the web and not just in discrete corners. More personalized for good or bad. Things will be filtered and customized for you. More mobile, meaning it'll be consumed more on mobile devices, but also through mobile applications rather than in a web browser. more automated in a variety of different ways that we've talked about, and more fragmented as well through those various platforms. And each of those things has benefits for users and potential drawbacks for users. They have benefits for people in marketing and drawbacks for people in marketing. So there's no simple answer about what the future of the internet is. There is no single definition of what Web 3.0 is, but it's really a combination of all of these things. So I'll stop there and ask if there are any more questions.
There's been quite a bit of chatter in the press about Facebook and that Facebook is dying. What do you see in a couple of years about where Facebook is going to be?
Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways it seemed unstoppable. There were some statistics in the last month or so that showed that US usage in particular seemed to have dropped off. The number of active users seemed to have dropped off a little bit. You know, you have to look at MySpace, which had a similar trajectory for a long period of time and then suddenly died off. It hasn't died off completely, but dropped off significantly, and Facebook kind of became the single company that people think about when they think about social networking. It's always possible for somebody else to come along that somehow has a disruptive model. You know, Google is always the sort of perennial threat in social networking. They just never seem to have quite figured out social. They just don't seem to have the DNA to do it. But it doesn't mean there isn't somebody else out there who might eventually do it better. People might get Facebook fatigue. They might make too many privacy infringing decisions and finally turn people off. So, you know, it could go either way. And for now, as I say, Facebook looks dominant. You know, the total number of active users keeps going up and up and up. But you know, there are some signs that it may be plateauing a little bit, and you know, certainly Twitter and other forces out there are powerful and are presenting alternatives. So you know, it could really go either way. But for now, you know, what is it? 500 million users. You know, it's you know, bigger than most countries, and it's a huge force to be reckoned with. And you know, even if it does start to taper off, it'll probably be a long time before it starts to really decline, if ever. So, other questions?
Can you come forward, because you're losing all your voice.
So one of the things that doesn't really come out of that is the role of brands within these spaces. Because quite a few of the things that you're talking about there, especially the kind of vulgarisation part of it, and the growth of apps. You think about the usage of Facebook on mobile, but actually there's no access to advertising on the mobile product. Is, you know, and our job is to connect with brands. You know, with customers.
Yeah.
Have you got any kind of viewpoint on kind of how brands kind of work to the kind of best strategies, to, you know, how to connect in this world, because it is changing quite dramatically. We all know the kind of like the banner side of it is a certain kind of business, it does one thing, but a lot of these other developments are actually kind of closing it down.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of what I was getting at in these slides towards the end here, where, you know, I mean, on the one hand, you've got the positive side of all of this, where you have new opportunities to get in front of people in new ways that are more targeted and therefore could be more effective, but then there are also the drawbacks that I talked about here. And I think what you're getting at is what do you do about all of these challenges here, and you know, there is no simple answer, but ultimately you have to go where your users are. So if you figure your users are spending a lot of time on Facebook, you have to find ways to get in there. Now the Facebook iPhone app, the Facebook Android app today don't serve up advertising, as you say, and so you know, how do you get in there? And you have to do that through the feed essentially, which means that you have to get through there in much more organic ways than just serving up an ad. You have to get users to click like, and people are doing some good things and some not so good things at the moment with using the like feature. I've seen a lot of websites now saying you have to like us to get access to content, and you know, I definitely won't do that because I don't like liking something before I know whether I like it, and I think there's a backlash against that at the moment. But I think there is that organic side of things where now, you know, from a mobile usage perspective, you're going to have to get users to really engage with your brand in a natural way and become advocates in a way that you haven't been able to do before. It's not an easy thing to do, but for a Facebook, for example, that is going to be the way it works. But for many other mobile applications, there are ads now, and you know, whether you go Apple's approach, where it's you know, through iAd and very high quality, you know, that's a good experience where it works, but many brands have been put off by all the hoops that Apple makes you jump through. You know, Android, through its acquisition, has been much more Wild West as they are about everything else, but actually more effective because the bar is lower and people have been able to get in there more easily. But we still haven't seen, I think, a really successful set of best practices for mobile advertising. It's something that we track a lot and write about a lot, but it's a very small space that's going to grow really big over the next few years, and nobody's quite figured out exactly what the new principles are. But clearly mobile advertising in all its different forms, whether that's through a mobile optimized website, whether that's through mobile apps, is going to be a major component of it as well. But you know, in all of this, it's going to be harder, it's going to be more challenging in a number of different ways, and that personalization, I think, is one of the single biggest challenges, because you just have no way of knowing for sure you're actually going to be able to reach the user you want to, because you don't know what's being filtered out.
The personalisation part is the fragmentation and organisation part of it. Your answer there is to be more bespoke, but by scale. You've got to make these decisions about creating bespoke solutions on these different platforms. It's too slow, too expensive.
Yeah, I mean, and there are some interesting things happening. We didn't talk about this very much, but the actual programming language of the web, HTML, has evolved. You know, that is the one part of the internet that does have version numbers in a true sense, and we're starting to see the use of HTML5, which is the latest version, and interestingly that's being branded in a way that previous versions of HTML never have been, because the hope is that it will provide an alternative to the native application experience. So you could actually create an experience that is as good as what you'd get from an application you'd buy from a store, but is actually just delivered through the web browser and just looks really good and it's really interactive, can even store things locally. And so there is starting to be something of a groundswell for HTML5 as a technology, which could overcome some of that fragmentation and balkanization, because you could develop a really good HTML5 mobile optimized website that could then work cross-platform. It could work equally well on an Android browser, on the Apple Safari browser, on the Palm browser, on the Microsoft Windows Phone browser. And when you get to that point, then you start to overcome some of that balkanization. But we're in the very early days of that. But that is one of the technologies that holds out some promise for overcoming that fragmentation and that kind of the islands that we're getting today with all these application stores and the operating systems that sit behind them. So there is some promise there, but you know, there is this inherent issue and it's not going to go away anytime soon. You just have to find ways to work around it, and in the meantime it probably does mean either picking your platforms, and there is some interesting research to be done around, you know, particular brands more likely to use iPhones, for example. I mean, if you go to the JetBlue terminal at JFK, you'll see nothing but Macs. I don't know why that is, but the people that like JetBlue, the airline, also seem to like Apple computers. And so you can sort of target by platform, but you may just have to accept that you have to spend more and be on multiple platforms, and that's just the reality now. So I don't think there's any simple answer.
And in line with this issue, I thought it was very interesting that you're saying that there's today more minutes spent per day on mobile applications than on web surfing. What are the implications for Google search business and for brand marketers?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Google and Apple are the two major players in mobile operating systems today, but if you look at their business models and their motivations for being in that business, they're extremely different. You know, Apple is trying to sell lots of devices. You know, this is their core business, and they want to sell more and more of these, and it's not going to be necessarily laptops, it'll be tablets, it'll be phones. They sell hardware and have huge margins on that and are very successful. Google is in the operating system business not to make money from devices, because they don't actually make the devices, nor to make money from the operating system, which they license essentially for free, but to get as many eyeballs out there on their advertising. They recognize that as things go from desktop to mobile, they absolutely need to be a dominant player in the mobile advertising space. And Android is a huge foot in that market and a huge platform for serving up advertising. It means they also get to tap into revenues from developers that create applications for those platforms and use their own advertising. So they're very much aware of it, and they say, you know, Android, you know, costs a lot of money to develop and costs a lot of money still to maintain, but it's paying for itself now through advertising, and they're at $1 billion run rate per year at the moment, and that's just going to grow over time. So, you know, they're very much there in the mobile space as well. The challenge is that they can't be as dominant in the mobile space because of the fragmentation that I talked about. They're never going to be the major supplier of advertising for Apple devices in the way that they will be for Android devices. So it is going to be more fragmented. Their market share is inherently going to be lower, but they've got the Android platform, they've got Google searches done for mobile devices, whether they're Google or other devices, and various other avenues to get mobile advertising onto those platforms. But they're very aware of that, and they're really pursuing it quite hard. Any other questions? Yes?
So you talked a lot about utilities on the web. Where do you see the future of entertainment? And I know we talked a little bit about this in the morning section as well, consumption of video content. But where do you see gaming and are there other new forms of entertainment for the web that we should be aware of?
Ultimately, I think there's going to be a lot of the content people consume online is just going to be new forms of existing types of content, whether that's video, whether it's music, whether it's gaming. There are also the new social games and so on. I mean, Zynga is a company that's built huge business off social gaming, whether it's Facebook-based, whether it's mobile application-based. And so there will be new business models like that around gaming, and the iPhone, for example, has become one of the biggest gaming platforms out there, even though it doesn't principally describe itself as that. It is now a major gaming platform, and other mobile operating systems will become that as well. But the way we see things going from a content perspective over the next few years is that people are increasingly going to be overwhelmed by the variety of different providers of content and applications and connectivity, and many people will want a more managed experience where they can pay a predictable amount per month for a combination of connectivity and content to a single provider who then manages all the complexity behind that. So that's the trend that we see taking shape over the next few years. And the Googles and the Apples, Samsung, Microsoft and others are in a good position to do that because they own the front end. They don't own the connectivity, but we increasingly expect the Kindle model, where you have a relationship with Amazon as a customer. You don't actually have a direct relationship with the carrier that's behind it. You just know that when you buy a book, somehow magically it gets delivered to the device. And so we see that model actually proliferating to the smartphone market over time as well, where Apple would actually provide you a bundle that included connectivity, which was wholesaled from whichever carrier it might be, or multiple carriers, and they've actually got some patents for technologies that allow them to do kind of what Google does with ad auctions, but Apple would do it with carrier minutes. Essentially say, okay, who's got a cheap minute for me right now? That's the network I'm going to use to carry this particular call or this text message or whatever it may be. So, we see things evolving in that direction over time. But the wealth of content that's actually going to be consumed in that model is enormous. It's going to be even more diverse than it is today. And I'm not going to make any specific predictions about different kinds of content that are going to emerge during that time, but there certainly will be many of the existing ones that will evolve in some way, and there will undoubtedly be new kinds of content that we haven't thought of yet as well. Any other questions? Nope. Okay, well, if you do have any more, my contact details are on the final slide. Hopefully you'll all get access to the slides, but if you don't, you can always send me an email or contact me on Twitter or whatever makes the most sense for you. My email address is very straightforward. It's my first name and then my last name at ovum.com, and my Twitter handle is even more straightforward. So you can see it right here, Jan Ovum. So feel free to contact me either of those ways or give me a call, and I'll be happy to kind of keep the dialogue going. So thanks very much for having me.